Tonight, let us travel across time and space, from the mist-covered mountains of feudal Japan to the sun-baked marble of ancient Rome. We are in the year 100 BCE, in a city that sits at the heart of the known world. The Roman Republic has stood for over 4 centuries, its eagles spreading across the Mediterranean, its legions crushing enemies from Iberia to the Levant. Yet beneath the grandeur, beneath the triumphal processions and senatorial debates, the old foundations are cracking. The Republic, built for a city-state, now governs an empire. And in this moment of tension between tradition and necessity, a child is born who will embody all the contradictions of his age. The Forum Romanum awakens each morning to the same rituals it has known for generations. Senators in their white togas bordered with purple stride toward the Curia, where matters of state will be debated according to customs older than memory. In the law courts, orators weave elaborate arguments, their voices rising and falling in practiced cadences designed to sway judges and juries. Merchants haggle in the marketplaces. Slaves carry water from the aqueducts. Temple priests perform their ancient sacrifices. Rome presents itself as eternal, unchanging, secure in the certainty of its institutions and traditions. But the boy Gaius Julius Caesar, growing up in the Subura district, one of Rome's more modest neighborhoods, would learn early that this appearance of stability masked a deeper turbulence. The Republic's political life had become a battleground between 2 broad factions: the Optimates, who represented the traditional aristocracy and sought to maintain senatorial authority, and the Hoho, populares, who appealed to the common citizens and pushed for reforms that threatened the established order. Caesar's family, though patrician and ancient, aligned themselves with the populares. His uncle by marriage was Gaius Marius, a military genius who had risen from relatively humble origins to dominate Roman politics, breaking precedent by serving as consul 7 times. Marius represented everything the traditional aristocracy feared: a new man, elevated by military success and popular appeal rather than by birth and senatorial connections, wielding power in ways that strained the careful balances of republican government. When Sulla, representing the Optimates, seized control through military force, the young Caesar found himself in immediate danger. Sulla's prescriptions, those terrible lists of names posted in the Forum, marked hundreds of men for death. Their crime was nothing more than having supported the wrong faction. Their property was confiscated, their families ruined, and bounties offered for their heads. It was politics reduced to its most brutal essence, the strong destroying the weak because they could. Caesar's refusal to divorce Cornelia, when Sulla demanded, it was more than youthful stubbornness. It was a declaration of principle, an assertion that some bonds transcended political expediency. For months he moved through Rome like a shadow, sleeping in different places, trusting only a few loyal servants and friends. The experience taught him lessons that formal education never could have provided. He learned that institutions offered no protection when powerful men chose to ignore them. He learned that survival often depended on loyal friends willing to risk themselves on your behalf. And he learned that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, that politics was fluid, that the only constant was the naked reality of power. When Sulla finally granted him clemency, largely through the intercession of influential family friends, Caesar left Rome for the east. Military service beckoned, offering both the opportunity to prove himself and the wisdom to absent himself from a city still dangerous for those associated with the losing side. In Asia Minor, serving on the staff of various provincial governors, Caesar distinguished himself in ways that would become characteristic. He was brave in combat, earning the civic crown for saving a fellow soldier's life during the siege of Mytilene. But more importantly, he showed a gift for winning loyalty from subordinates and respect from superiors. The pirate incident, which occurred during his return journey to Rome, revealed aspects of his character that would define his later career. When captured and held for ransom, Caesar did not simply endure his captivity. He dominated it. He made himself the center of attention, through sheer force of personality, turning his captors into an audience for his wit and poetry. His promise to return and crucify them was delivered with such casual confidence that they assumed it was a joke. It was not. The speed with which he organized a pursuit force after his release demonstrated organizational ability and determination. The fact that he kept his promise about crucifixion showed that his word, once given, was inviolable. And the mercy he showed by having them killed before crucifixion revealed a man who understood that ruthlessness could be tempered with humanity without losing its effectiveness. Back in Rome, Caesar began his political ascent through the cursus honorum, that ladder of offices that ambitious Romans climbed. He served as military tribune, as quaestor in Spain, as aedile responsible for public games and festivals. Each position was used not merely to fulfill its duties, but to build visibility, to create networks of obligation and support, to establish himself in the public mind as a man of consequence. His spending on public games while aedile was lavish, plunging him into debt but earning him tremendous popularity with the common people. The aristocracy sneered at such populist appeals, but Caesar understood something they did not. In a republic where citizens voted, popularity was convertible into political power. The games he sponsored were remembered long after the debts were settled. The goodwill they generated would pay dividends for years. When he won election as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, at an unusually young age, it was a signal that he had arrived as a major political figure. The position carried immense prestige and, more practically, provided a public residence and immunity from certain types of prosecution. Caesar was building not just a career, but a fortress of interlocking positions and protections that would be difficult for his enemies to assault. Yet for all his success, he remained in the shadow of more powerful men. Pompey the Great had conquered the East and stood as Rome's most celebrated general. Crassus, whose wealth dwarfed that of any other Roman, wielded influence through loans and patronage that created webs of obligation across the city. These were the giants of Roman politics, and Caesar, for all his cleverness and charisma, was not yet their equal. But he was learning. He watched how Pompey commanded loyalty from his troops, through both generosity and shared hardship. He observed how Crassus built power through financial rather than military means, understanding that men could be bound as effectively by debt as by oath. And he began to formulate his own path to greatness, one that would require both men to play their parts, perhaps without fully realizing they were doing so. The Forum in late afternoon cast long shadows across marble columns and ancient temples. Senators departed after a day of debate, their clients and supporters following in carefully ordered processions. In the taverns and bathhouses, in the homes of the wealthy and the tenements of the poor, Romans discussed politics with the passion that came from living in a city where politics was not abstract but immediate, where the decisions made in the Senate could mean prosperity or ruin, peace or war, life or death. And through these streets walked Caesar, still in his 30s, ambitious but not yet fulfilled, clever but not yet tested by supreme command, hungry for something more than the limited glory Rome's traditional offices could provide. He needed opportunity, and he was patient enough to wait for it, bold enough to seize it when it came, and ruthless enough to exploit it fully once it was in his grasp. The die was not yet cast. The Rubicon remained uncrossed. But the pieces were moving into position for a drama that would end the Republic and birth an empire. And at the center of it all, charming, calculating, brilliant, and dangerous, stood Gaius Julius Caesar, who had survived when survival seemed impossible, and who now intended to rise higher than Roman tradition said any one man should go. Spring arrives in Gaul with a gentleness that belies the violence to come. The great forests stretch northward beyond sight, broken by rivers that flow toward unknown seas and valleys, where tribes have lived according to their own laws and customs for longer than memory records. This is 58 BCE, and Gaul is not a single nation, but a tapestry of peoples. Helvetii, Arverni, Aedui, Belgi, each with their own territories, their own rivalries, their own complex web of alliances and enmities. Into this world, commanding 4 legions with authority to recruit more, comes Gaius Julius Caesar, proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, seeking glory, gold, and the military reputation that would make him unstoppable in Roman politics. Caesar's governorship of Gaul was supposed to last 5 years. It would stretch to 9, and in that time he would fight battles that became legendary, write commentaries that students would study for millennia, and transform himself from a politician who had led troops into a general worthy of comparison with Alexander. But more than personal glory was at stake. The campaigns in Gaul would forge the most formidable military force Rome had ever fielded, an army loyal not to the Senate or the Republic, but to Caesar himself, bound to him by shared hardships, generous pay, and the knowledge that he would lead them to riches and glory. The initial justification for military action came from Rome's Gallic allies, who requested assistance against migrating tribes. This was how Roman expansion often worked, not through naked aggression, but through a gradual process of intervention in local disputes. Protection extended to allies, threats neutralized before they could mature. Each action was defensive, each campaign necessary, and yet somehow Roman territory continued to expand, and more peoples found themselves either destroyed or absorbed into the growing empire. Caesar's military genius lay not in revolutionary tactics, but in the ruthless application of Roman military doctrine combined with extraordinary logistical planning and personal leadership. Roman legions were already formidable instruments of war, disciplined, flexible, capable of building fortifications and siege equipment as readily as they fought in formation. But Caesar pushed them harder, marched them farther, and demanded more from them than other generals dared. And because he shared their hardships, sleeping in camps rather than comfortable quarters, eating soldiers' rations, showing himself in the thick of battle, they gave him what he asked. The campaign against the Helvetii demonstrated his method. When this tribe attempted to migrate westward through Roman-allied territory, Caesar pursued them relentlessly, refusing battle until the moment and terrain suited him, then striking with devastating effectiveness. The survivors, broken and desperate, were ordered back to their original territories. The message to Gaul was clear. Roman power, once engaged, was implacable. But each victory brought new complications. Defeating one tribe alarmed their neighbors, leading to new alliances against Rome, necessitating new campaigns. The Germanic tribes across the Rhine, led by Ariovistus, were invited by some Gauls as protection against Rome, but viewed by Caesar as a threat to be eliminated. The subsequent battle, though Caesar's forces were outnumbered, and his own troops were initially fearful of the Germans' fierce reputation, ended in complete Roman victory. Ariovistus fled across the Rhine, and Caesar had secured a reputation as the man who had pushed back the Germanic threat. The Belgic Confederation in the north, alarmed by Caesar's rapid subjugation of central Gaul, raised an enormous army. Caesar met them in a series of brutal engagements where Roman discipline and engineering proved decisive. When the Nervi launched a surprise attack on his legions while they were building camp, catching them unprepared and nearly routing them, Caesar personally grabbed a shield and fought in the front ranks, rallying his men through visible presence and courage. The Nervi were virtually annihilated, and Caesar's legend grew year followed year. Expeditions crossed the Rhine into Germania and twice crossed the Channel to Britain. neither resulting in permanent conquest, but both demonstrating that no natural barrier could contain Roman power when Caesar commanded it. These campaigns were as much about prestige as strategic necessity. No Roman general had ever led armies to Britain, that mysterious island at the edge of the known world. Now Caesar had done so, and Rome marveled. But the Gauls were learning. Initial defeats and disunity gave way to a growing sense that Rome represented not temporary intervention, but permanent subjugation. In 52 BCE, under the leadership of Vercingetorix, a chieftain of the Arverni, who combined military skill with charisma and strategic vision, the Gallic tribes mounted their most serious resistance. For the first time, they employed scorched earth tactics, denying Caesar's legions the supplies they needed, forcing him to divide his forces, striking at his supply lines. The campaign that followed tested Caesar as no previous campaign had. Vercingetorix was a worthy opponent, perhaps the only one Caesar faced in Gaul who could match him in strategic thinking. The Gallic leader understood he could not defeat the legions in open battle, so he refused to give Caesar the decisive engagement he sought. Instead, Vercingetorix harried the Romans, struck at their weakest points, retreated behind fortifications when necessary, and slowly ground down Caesar's advantages. The siege of Alesia was the culmination of this deadly chess match. Vercingetorix, after a tactical withdrawal, fortified himself on a hill surrounded by rivers and steep approaches, his army secure behind wooden palisades and stone walls. Caesar, rather than attempt a costly assault, did what Romans did best: he built. His legions constructed an 11-mile wall around the entire hillside, a circumvallation that trapped the Gauls inside, cutting them off from supplies. But Vercingetorix had sent for help before the siege was complete, and a massive Gallic relief army, perhaps 250,000 warriors, was approaching. Caesar faced a tactical nightmare, besieging a fortified position while himself being surrounded by superior numbers. His response was characteristically bold. His legions built a second wall, this one 14 miles long, facing outward, a contravallation that would protect them from the relief army. The resulting battle occurred on multiple fronts simultaneously. Gallic forces attacked from inside and outside the Roman lines, trying to break through, trying to rescue the trapped army, or at least enable them to escape. For days the fighting continued, with Roman discipline and engineering barely holding against overwhelming numbers and desperate courage. Caesar moved constantly along the lines, reinforcing weak points, leading cavalry charges, his personal presence stabilizing sectors on the verge of collapse. Pompey and the bulk of the Senate evacuated Rome without offering battle, retreating to southern Italy and then to Greece, taking with them the legitimacy of republican government. Their plan was sound in conception: buy time to raise and train armies, use their control of Rome's eastern provinces and their superior naval forces to strangle Caesar logistically, then return with overwhelming strength. But it conceded Italy to Caesar without a fight, and with Italy went crucial resources and, more importantly, the appearance that Caesar held the initiative. The civil war that followed would last 4 years and engulf the entire Mediterranean. Caesar's campaigns took him to Spain, where he defeated Pompeian forces and secured the western provinces. Then he crossed to Greece, despite Pompey's naval superiority, risking everything on a bold gambit that his generalship could overcome the enemy's advantages in numbers and resources. The decisive confrontation came at Pharsalus in 48 BC. Pompey, pressured by the senators accompanying him to give battle despite his preference for further delay, deployed superior numbers on ground of his choosing. The coming battle would pit Rome's 2 greatest generals against each other, each commanding legions that viewed themselves as Rome's finest soldiers. Both armies contained men who had fought side by side in previous wars. Now they would meet as enemies, and thousands would die so that one man could claim supremacy over the crumbling republic. Caesar's tactical brilliance turned the tide. Despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1, he identified the key moment when Pompey's cavalry, which should have rolled up his flank, could be disrupted by a hidden cohort of infantry instructed to target riders specifically rather than horses. When Pompey's cavalry broke and fled, his entire battle plan collapsed. The Pompeian infantry, exposed and demoralized, fought bravely, but could not overcome the collapsing tactical situation. By day's end, Caesar stood victorious, and Pompey was fleeing toward Egypt. The pursuit ended not with capture, but with murder. When Pompey arrived in Egypt, seeking refuge with the young King Ptolemy XIII, the Egyptians calculated that Caesar's favor was worth more than hospitality to his defeated rival. They killed Pompey as he stepped ashore and preserved his severed head as a gift for Caesar. When Caesar arrived days later and was presented with this grisly trophy, sources report that he wept. Whether from genuine grief over the death of a former friend and ally, or from rage that his enemy had been denied the clemency he had planned to extend, we cannot know with certainty. What followed in Egypt was unexpected. Caesar, with a small force, became entangled in a civil war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister wife Cleopatra VII. His decision to support Cleopatra would have profound consequences. The Alexandrine War that resulted saw Caesar besieged in the palace quarter of Alexandria, cut off from reinforcements, facing a hostile population and the Egyptian army. It was the most dangerous position he had been in since Alesia, perhaps more dangerous, because he commanded far fewer troops and had no room for strategic maneuver. Yet he held out until reinforcements arrived from Asia, then crushed the Egyptian forces in battle. Ptolemy drowned fleeing across the Nile, and Cleopatra was secured on the throne, ruling jointly with a younger brother, but in reality holding sole power under Roman protection. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra was both political and personal, an alliance of mutual benefit and apparent genuine affection. She would bear him a son, Caesarion, though Caesar never publicly acknowledged the paternity. After Egypt came swift campaigns in Asia Minor, where Roman authority needed restoration. The speed of Caesar's victory against Pharnacus II, king of Pontus, inspired one of history's most famous military dispatches. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. 3 words that captured both the reality of the campaign and Caesar's genius for self-promotion. By 46 BCE, Caesar was back in Rome, having defeated the last significant Pompeian forces in Africa. He had won the civil war. The question now was what he would do with victory. The Republic, battered and broken, still technically existed. But everyone knew that real power rested with the man who commanded the loyalty of the legions. Caesar had become what Romans had feared and resisted for 5 centuries. A king in all but name, ruling not through republican institutions, but through military supremacy. The Tiber flows as it always has, indifferent to the rise and fall of human affairs. The 7 hills remain unchanged, though the buildings upon them are transformed. And in the Forum, where once senators debated as equals, a single man's will now shapes all decisions. The Republic persists as a fiction, a comforting ghost that allows Romans to pretend nothing fundamental has changed. But the crossing of that small northern river, 3 years earlier, had altered everything, had set in motion forces that could not be recalled, had transformed ambition into power and power into tyranny. However benevolent that tyranny might appear, Caesar stands at the summit of achievement, having accomplished what no Roman before him dared attempt. He has conquered Gaul, won a civil war, and broken the power of the Senate to constrain him. Ahead lie months of reorganization, of triumph, of reforms that will reshape Roman governance. But ahead also lie the daggers of men who believe they are saving the Republic from tyranny. Men who cannot accept that the old order is already dead, who think assassination can turn back history's tide. The rooster's crow pierces the pre-dawn darkness, somewhere in the tangle of apartments that climb the Esquiline Hill, in a third-floor insula, a cramped tenement building where Rome's working poor make their homes. A baker named Marcus Tullius rises from his straw mattress. The room he shares with his wife, 2 children, and his aging mother measures perhaps 12 feet square. There are no windows, only wooden shutters that open onto the narrow street below, letting in both light and the constant noise of the city. Marcus does not light an oil lamp. Oil is expensive, and dawn will arrive soon enough. He moves by memory and long practice, finding his tunic where he left it draped over a stool, pulling on leather sandals worn thin at the soles. His wife stirs, but does not wake. She will rise later to manage the shop while he works the ovens. Their children, aged 7 and 9, sleep curled together on a pallet in the corner. They will attend the ludus, the elementary school, for a few more years if fortune permits, learning to read and calculate well enough to perhaps rise slightly above their parents' station. The stairs are treacherous in darkness, worn smooth by decades of feet, steep and narrow. Marcus descends carefully, one hand against the wall, avoiding the loose board on the second-floor landing that has been broken for months. The landlord, who owns 6 such buildings in the Suburra and lives himself in a comfortable domus near the Forum, shows little interest in repairs unless a tenant threatens legal action, and few tenants can afford lawyers. The street outside is already stirring. Night soil collectors make their rounds, emptying chamber pots and cesspits that will be hauled to the fields outside the city walls where farmers pay for the privilege of spreading human waste on their crops. Water carriers fill their amphorae at the public fountain, preparing for their daily rounds to apartments that lack plumbing. A prostitute leans in a doorway, finishing her night's work, her painted face garish in the torchlight. She nods to Marcus, a familiar face in the neighborhood, and he nods back without judgment. Everyone in the Suburra does what they must to survive. Marcus's bakery occupies the ground floor of another insula 3 streets over. The ovens are already warm, the apprentice having arrived even earlier to stoke the fires. The boy, perhaps 13, is the son of Marcus's dead brother, taken in as family obligation and cheap labor. He will learn the trade, inherit the business someday if fortune smiles, and if Marcus produces no son to claim it. The work begins in earnest. Dough prepared the previous evening has risen overnight. Marcus's hands, scarred from years of burns, work the dough with practiced efficiency, shaping loaves and rolls. The bread must be ready when shops open, when workers heading to their labor stop to buy their morning meal, when slaves arrive with their master's coins to purchase the day's supply. Competition is fierce. 3 other bakeries operate within 5 blocks, and customers are loyal only until someone offers fresher bread or lower prices. The morning light creeps down the narrow streets, never quite reaching the ground in these canyons of tenement buildings that lean toward each other, sometimes nearly touching at their upper floors. Rome has perhaps 1 million inhabitants, crowded into a space never designed for such numbers. The wealthy retreat to their spacious homes on the Palatine and Aventine hills, but the poor pack into the Suburra, the Valabrum, the Transtiberum, districts where buildings rise 6 or 7 stories high, where fire is a constant terror, where collapse claims lives with depressing regularity. A customer arrives, a fuller who operates a laundry and cloth cleaning establishment nearby. He complains about the price, as always, but pays, as always. Marcus knows his customers' rhythms, their preferences, their financial situations. The fuller will buy 6 loaves, 1 for himself and his family, 5 to resell to his workers at a markup. The fuller, like Marcus, is caught in the middle, neither poor enough to starve nor wealthy enough to relax, forever calculating margins, forever one disaster away from ruin. A senator's slave appears, a Greek who speaks Latin with an accent that marks him as educated, probably a pedagogue responsible for teaching his master's children. He carries a list written on wax tablets and sufficient coins to fill the order without haggling. His tunic is clean, his sandals unpatched. The senator's household, like all wealthy households, maintains its own ovens and kitchen slaves, but occasionally purchases from commercial bakeries, either from necessity or whim. The pedagogue buys the most expensive loaves, white bread made from refined flour, free of the bran and grit that characterizes the darker bread working people eat. He does not engage in conversation, conducting the transaction with the polite distance that marks interactions between free tradesmen and aristocratic slaves who consider themselves superior by virtue of their master's status. By the time the sun fully rises, Marcus has sold perhaps 40 loaves. The morning rush will continue for another hour, then slow until evening when workers return home. He will spend the afternoon preparing dough for the next day, maintaining his ovens, perhaps catching an hour of sleep during the hottest part of the day, when even the energy of Rome briefly flags. This is not the Rome of triumphal processions and senatorial debates. This is the Rome that wakes before dawn to bake bread, to haul water, to empty chamber pots, to wash clothes, to sweep streets. This is the Rome of a million ordinary people whose names will never be recorded, whose lives will leave no monuments, who nonetheless constitute the living body of the city that calls itself eternal. Without them, the senators would have no togas to wear, the emperors no grain to distribute, the legions no boots to march in. Rome rests on their shoulders, though Rome rarely acknowledges the weight. The Forum Romanum at midday pulses with the organized chaos that characterizes the heart of any great city. Senators in their distinctive togas, bordered with purple, stride toward the Curia for a session of debate on some matter of provincial taxation or judicial procedure. Lawyers cluster under the porticos, speaking in rapid Latin to clients who nod with varying degrees of comprehension. Money changers sit at tables, converting Greek drachmas and Egyptian debens into Roman denarii, their abacuses clicking as they calculate exchange rates that always favor themselves. Merchants display goods from across the empire: Spanish olive oil, Gallic wine, Egyptian grain, Asian silk, British tin. But to focus only on commerce and politics is to miss the forum's social dimension. This is Rome's living room, the place where citizens come not merely to conduct business, but to see and be seen, to hear the latest gossip, to form the connections and alliances that constitute the invisible architecture of Roman life. Near the rostra, the speaker's platform decorated with the bronze beaks of captured warships, a crowd has gathered around an orator. He is not a magistrate or anyone of particular importance, simply a citizen exercising his right to speak on public affairs. His topic is corruption in the grain distribution, a perennial complaint that always finds an audience. Some listeners are genuinely concerned. Others are clients of rival political factions, present to heckle or applaud according to their patrons' interests. Still others are simply bored, attracted by the crowd, hoping for entertainment. The orator's delivery is practiced, full of rhetorical flourishes and dramatic pauses. Roman education places heavy emphasis on public speaking. And any man with political ambitions must master the art of swaying crowds through voice and gesture. He cites specific cases, names corrupt officials, invokes the gods as witnesses to his sincerity. Whether his accusations have merit matters less than whether he can make them sound convincing. A philosopher has taken up position near the temple of Saturn, holding forth on Stoic ethics to a small group of interested listeners. He is Greek, probably a freedman, one of thousands of Greek intellectuals who have flooded Rome as the empire expanded eastward. Romans have ambivalent feelings about Greeks. They admire Greek culture, hire Greek tutors for their children, collect Greek art, and read Greek literature. But they also disdain Greeks as defeated peoples, clever but unmanly, too intellectual to be trusted with practical affairs. The philosopher seems untroubled by this paradox, accepting the coins his listeners occasionally toss into his cup while explaining that true happiness comes from virtue rather than wealth or pleasure. At a fountain where water flows continuously from the aqueduct that supplies this section of the city, women gather with their amphorae. Fetching water is women's work, though some wealthy families send slaves instead. The fountain is a social hub where news is exchanged, marriages are arranged, and reputations are made or destroyed. The women speak in rapid colloquial Latin, quite different from the formal language of literature and law. Their conversation, a mix of practical concerns and neighborhood gossip. One woman complains about her husband's drinking. Another boasts about her son's appointment to a minor municipal post. A third warns against doing business with a particular merchant known to use false weights. They discuss food prices, upcoming festivals, whose daughter is approaching marriageable age. Their knowledge of neighborhood affairs is encyclopedic, an informal intelligence network that often knows of scandals and conflicts before official authorities do. A marriage procession passes through the forum, as custom requires. The bride, heavily veiled, is led by her father toward her new husband's home. Musicians play flutes and tambourines. Well-wishers shower the procession with nuts, a fertility symbol. The bride's face cannot be seen behind her flame-colored veil, the flammeum, but her posture suggests youth, perhaps nervousness. She may be as young as 12 or 13, the minimum legal age for girls to marry, wed to a man she perhaps met only at the betrothal ceremony. Or she may be older, a widow remarrying, or a woman whose first betrothal was broken. The procession tells the observer nothing of the personal story behind the public ritual. Near the law courts, a crowd is gathered for a trial. Roman trials are public spectacles, and high-profile cases attract audiences as theatrical performances do. The defendant today is a provincial governor accused of extortion, charged with demanding illegal payments from the cities he governed. His prosecutor is young, building a reputation, hoping that a successful prosecution will launch a political career. The defender is older, more experienced, speaking with the confidence of someone who has won many such cases and expects to win this one. The trial proceeds not through examination of documents or questioning of witnesses, though both occur, but primarily through speeches. Each side presents its narrative, adorns it with rhetorical flourishes, appeals to the jury's emotions and prejudices. Evidence matters, but presentation matters more. A skilled orator can sometimes win a case despite weak facts, while a poor speaker may lose despite truth on his side. The jury, composed of senators and equestrians, depending on the nature of the case, listens with varying degrees of attention. Some are genuinely weighing the evidence. Others have already decided based on political alliances or personal connections. Still others are bored, attending only because jury duty is a civic obligation and failure to serve carries penalties. When the speeches conclude and the vote is taken, The verdict will reflect not justice in any abstract sense, but the complicated interplay of law, politics, rhetoric, and personal relationships that characterizes all Roman governance. A slave auction proceeds near the temple of Castor and Pollux. The auctioneer, standing on a platform with his merchandise displayed beside him, calls out descriptions and starting prices. The slaves stand nearly naked, allowing potential buyers to inspect them for physical defects, signs of disease, or skills that might increase their value. Some are prisoners of war, captured in recent campaigns and transported to Rome for sale. Others are born slaves, the children of enslaved parents, raised in slavery and knowing no other condition. Still others are freedmen who have somehow fallen back into slavery, perhaps through debt or criminal conviction. A prosperous-looking merchant examines a young Greek carefully, checking his teeth, his muscle tone, asking him questions in Greek to assess his education. The slave responds in cultured Greek, marking him as probably from an educated family, perhaps captured when his city fell to Roman forces. The merchant nods, satisfied, and begins negotiating with the auctioneer. If purchased, the slave will likely serve as a secretary or accountant, his education making him valuable for administrative work. His price will reflect this, several times what an uneducated laborer would cost. Nearby, a farmer from the countryside examines agricultural slaves with the eye of someone buying equipment. He prods their muscles, asks about their experience with oxen and plows, shows no interest in their origin stories or former lives. He needs bodies capable of hard labor, nothing more. The slaves he eventually purchases will work his fields, sleep in barracks, eat simple food, and likely die young from overwork and inadequate care. This is the reality of slavery, unglamorized and brutal, though Romans generally prefer not to examine it too closely. The forum empties somewhat as afternoon heat builds, and citizens retreat to their homes for the customary rest period. Shops close for several hours. Even the most energetic business activity pauses. Rome surrenders to the sun, waiting for evening's relative cool before resuming its ceaseless activity. A pattern repeats daily, has repeated for centuries, will presumably continue repeating for centuries more. Rome's rhythms seem as eternal as the city claims to be. The baths open in the early afternoon, and Romans of all social classes flock to them. The great imperial baths, like the baths of Agrippa, or later the baths of Caracalla, are architectural marvels, vast complexes containing not just bathing facilities, but gardens, libraries, exercise areas, and social spaces. But neighborhood baths serve the majority, smaller establishments scattered throughout the city's districts, charging a minimal entrance fee that even laborers can afford. Gaius Secundus, a shopkeeper who sells pottery in the Velabrum district, arrives at his local baths carrying a small bag containing a strigil for scraping oil and dirt from his skin, a towel, and a change of clothes. The entrance fee is a quadrans, the smallest copper coin, about what he would pay for a loaf of bread. He pays the attendant and enters a world temporarily removed from the stratifications of Roman society. The baths are among Rome's most democratic institutions. Senators and slaves alike come to bathe, though they may arrive at different times or use different sections. The process is standardized. First, the changing room, where clothes are left with an attendant, hopefully trustworthy. Then the exercise area, where men practice with weights, play ball games, or wrestle, then through a series of rooms of increasing temperature. The tepidarium provides warm comfort. The caldarium offers intense heat from underfloor heating systems. And finally, the frigidarium shocks with cold water, closing the pores and invigorating the body. But bathing is merely the nominal purpose. The baths serve primarily as social clubs where Romans spend hours conversing, conducting business, forming friendships and alliances. Gaius encounters a customer who owes him money and delicately reminds him of the debt. He discusses pottery designs with a contractor who might place a large order. He hears gossip about neighborhood affairs, whose wife was seen with another man, whose business is failing, whose son has joined the legions. Information flows freely in the baths, perhaps more freely than anywhere else in Rome, except the Forum. The baths also house small vendors who sell sausages, cakes, and wine to patrons who grow hungry or thirsty during their extended visits. A masseur offers his services, kneading sore muscles with oil-slicked hands. A depilator removes unwanted body hair with tweezers, a painful but popular service. Romans, especially upper-class Romans, prefer hairless bodies, considering excessive hair barbaric. The depilator works methodically, gossiping with his clients, hearing confessions and secrets that he will later trade for information or small favors. As evening approaches, attention turns toward entertainment. Rome offers distractions for every taste and budget. The wealthy retreat to private dinner parties, where elaborate meals featuring exotic delicacies are accompanied by music, poetry readings, and philosophical discussions. The poor gather in taverns and wine shops, cramped establishments where watered wine flows freely, and dice games offer the perpetual hope of sudden fortune. On days when games are scheduled at the Circus Maximus or the amphitheater, Rome's entertainment takes on a collective character. The Circus Maximus, Rome's enormous chariot racing venue, can hold perhaps 250,000 spectators, a quarter of the city's population. The races themselves are spectacular. Teams of horses pulling lightweight chariots around a track at dangerous speeds, drivers risking death for glory and the substantial prizes victory brings. But the races are also intensely factional. Romans support one of four teams, identified by colors: red, white, blue, or green. These allegiances run deep, passed from father to son, defended with passion that can erupt into violence. Betting is ubiquitous, ranging from small wagers between friends to substantial sums placed with professional bookmakers. Fortunes change with every race, and occasionally riots break out when supporters believe their team has been unfairly treated. Lucius Fabius, a young man from a modest equestrian family, sits in the lower tiers reserved for his social class. He has bet heavily on the greens today, convinced that their lead driver, a freedman named Diocles, who has won over 1,000 races, cannot lose. The morning's races have gone well, and Lucius calculates that if Diocles wins the afternoon's featured race, he will recoup last month's losses and perhaps have enough left to purchase a new toga for the upcoming festival. The race begins. 12 chariots launch from the starting gates, immediately jockeying for position. The track is narrow, and collisions are common, even encouraged. Drivers carry knives to cut themselves free if they become tangled in the reins during a crash. Death is an expected part of the sport, and successful drivers who survive long enough to retire become wealthy and famous. The crowd roars with each lap, factions screaming encouragement to their team, curses at opponents. Diocles drives with the calculated aggression that has made him legendary. He takes risks, but not foolish ones, passes on the inside when gaps appear, blocks opponents when necessary. On the final lap, he makes his move, whipping his horses into a desperate sprint, edging past the Blues' lead driver on the turn, holding the inside line as they hurtle toward the finish. The crowd explodes in noise. Lucius leaps to his feet, screaming himself hoarse, temporarily forgetting his social dignity in the sheer excitement of victory. But not everyone is celebrating. In the section where blue supporters sit, anger builds. They are convinced the race was fixed, that the judges favored the Greens, that Diocles employed illegal blocking tactics. Arguments break out. Fists fly. The urban cohorts, Rome's police force, move in to restore order, their clubs falling indiscriminately on combatants. Lucius, suddenly aware of the danger, pushes toward the exits, clutching his winnings, hoping to extract himself before the violence escalates. This is Rome at play, as passionate in its leisure as in its politics, as willing to fight over entertainment as over matters of state. The games serve multiple purposes. They distract the population from hardships. They demonstrate imperial generosity when emperors sponsor particularly lavish spectacles. And they provide outlets for factional energies that might otherwise be directed at more dangerous targets. Later moralists would condemn the games as symptoms of decadence, but for Romans living through them, they are simply part of life's fabric, neither questioned nor particularly examined. As night falls and the crowds disperse, Rome transitions into its nocturnal mode. Respectable citizens retreat indoors, for the streets after dark belong to a different city. Gangs of young aristocrats roam looking for trouble, protected by their social status from serious consequences. Thieves and cutthroats operate in the shadows, preying on the unwary or drunk. Prostitutes solicit customers more openly than during daylight hours. The night watch patrols, but their numbers are insufficient to truly control a city this size, and they are often corrupt, willing to look the other way for the right price. In his Ensala apartment, Marcus the baker sleeps uneasily, aware of every creak and footfall, one ear always alert for the cry of fire. That might send him and his family scrambling for the exits. Rome burns regularly, its wooden apartments and oil lamps, a perfect combination for disaster. And when fire starts in these densely packed neighborhoods, it spreads with terrifying speed. The memory of the great fire under Nero, which destroyed much of the city, remains vivid in collective memory, a reminder that even in eternal Rome, destruction is always one spark away. Dawn on the calends of March brings Rome to the Temple of Mars for one of the year's many religious festivals. Religion permeates every aspect of Roman life, not as a separate sphere of activity, but as an integral part of civic identity and daily routine. The gods are everywhere, in homes where household spirits receive daily offerings, in street corner shrines where passers-by pause to pray, in great temples where state ceremonies honor the divine powers that protect Rome, the pontiffs. Rome's priestly officials have consulted the sacred books and declared this day auspicious for the ceremony. Magistrates in their official regalia lead the procession from the Forum up the Capitoline Hill. Musicians play ancient hymns on double flutes. Attendants lead the sacrificial animals, bulls with gilded horns, who walk docilely toward their deaths. Citizens line the route, not as passive observers, but as participants in a collective act that binds community to gods and to each other. At the temple's altar, the ceremony proceeds according to forms so ancient that their origins are lost. The presiding magistrate, his head covered by his toga in the traditional manner, recites prayers in archaic Latin that even educated Romans barely understand. The words matter less than their correct delivery. An error, even a stumble over a syllable, invalidates the ceremony and requires starting over. Roman religion is contractual. Gods provide protection and favor in exchange for proper worship. And proper means following prescribed forms exactly. The bull is led forward. The sacrificing priest, the victimarius, approaches with an axe. The animal's throat is cut in a single practiced stroke. Blood pours onto the altar while priests examine the animal's liver for omens. The liver's appearance will be interpreted as the god's response to Rome's prayers, favorable or unfavorable, accepting or rejecting the sacrifice. The entire process is simultaneously sacred and bureaucratic, mystical and transactional. For most Romans, religion is not primarily about personal belief or inner spiritual life. It is about maintaining the pax deorum, the peace with the gods that ensures Rome's prosperity and security. The gods are powers to be propitiated, not moral authorities to be obeyed. They can be bargained with, flattered, even occasionally deceived. What matters is correct performance of rituals, not sincerity of heart. This pragmatic approach coexists uneasily with philosophical traditions imported from Greece. Stoicism, Epicureanism, and other schools offer systematic explanations of the universe and humanity's place within it, sometimes contradicting traditional religious narratives. Educated Romans navigate this tension with varying degrees of success. Some become skeptics, performing public religious duties out of civic obligation while privately doubting the god's existence. Others compartmentalize, maintaining traditional practices while adopting philosophical views that theoretically contradict them. Still others attempt synthesis, reinterpreting myths allegorically or identifying Roman gods with Greek philosophical principles. But for the majority of Romans, such intellectual complications are irrelevant. They pray to Mars before battles, to Venus for success in love, to Mercury for profit in business, to Vesta for the heart's safety. They consult astrologers and diviners, wear amulets against evil, observe lucky and unlucky days. Their world teems with supernatural forces that must be managed through proper rituals and offerings. Foreign religions complicate this landscape. As Rome's empire expands, new gods arrive with conquered peoples. The Great Mother from Phrygia, Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia. Each finds adherents among Romans seeking something traditional religion does not provide. These mystery cults, as they are called, offer personal salvation, secret knowledge, and intensive emotional experiences. They are viewed with suspicion by authorities, who worry about their potential for creating loyalties that transcend civic identity. Judaism presents particular challenges. Jews refuse to honor Roman gods, claiming exclusive worship for their own deity. This intolerance violates Roman religious pluralism, which typically accommodates new gods by adding them to the pantheon rather than rejecting existing ones. Romans grant Jews exemptions from certain civic religious duties because Jewish religion is ancient and therefore respectable, but they regard Jewish exclusivism as bizarre and potentially dangerous. Christianity, which emerges from Judaism in Rome's eastern provinces, shares this exclusivism but lacks Judaism's antiquity. Early Christians refused to participate in civic religious ceremonies, will not offer even token sacrifices to the emperor's genius. To Romans, this appears not as monotheistic conviction, but as antisocial behavior, as refusal to participate in the rituals that bind society together. Periodic persecutions result, not from theological disagreement, but from the perception that Christians threaten civic cohesion. In the Jewish quarter across the Tiber, Sarah Bat Judah prepares for Shabbat. Her family came to Rome 2 generations earlier, part of the diaspora that spread throughout the Mediterranean following the destruction of Jerusalem. They have prospered modestly, operating a shop that sells imported spices and perfumes. Roman prejudices against Jews affect their business. Some customers refuse to deal with them, but enough Romans appreciate quality goods that the family survives. Sarah's father reads from the Torah scroll their synagogue community maintains. One of several such communities in Rome. The prayer service is in Hebrew, a language Sarah barely understands. But the familiarity of the ritual connects her across time and space to ancestors in Judea and to Jews scattered across the empire. After the service, the family shares a meal: bread, wine, fish prepared according to kashrut laws that seem strange to the Roman neighbors. Living in Rome while maintaining Jewish identity requires constant negotiation. Sarah's brothers attend Roman schools, learning Latin and Greek, studying classical literature that sometimes presents Jews unfavorably. They must navigate between assimilating enough to function in Roman society and maintaining enough distinctiveness to preserve their heritage. The tension is sharpest during festivals, when Romans expect everyone to participate in public celebrations, honoring gods the Jews cannot acknowledge. But Rome, for all its prejudices, offers Jewish communities something rare in the ancient world: relative stability and legal protection. Jews are not citizens unless individually granted citizenship, but they are not slaves either. They can own property, conduct business, practice their religion. The price of this tolerance is accepting subordinate status and avoiding actions Romans might interpret as sedition. It is not equality, but compared to alternatives, it is acceptable. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in the Transtiberum, followers of Christ gather secretly. They are few, perhaps 30 people, drawn from across Roman society. Slaves, freedmen, a few citizens, even one equestrian who risks his status by association with this suspicious group. They share a meal they call agape, love feast, and speak of an executed criminal they believe rose from death and will return to establish God's kingdom. To Romans who hear rumors of these gatherings, they sound dangerous. Talk of a kingdom challenges imperial authority. Refusal to sacrifice suggests disloyalty. And garbled reports of their body and blood ritual suggest cannibalism. But the Christians themselves see their faith as offering what Rome cannot: forgiveness of sins, promise of eternal life, a community bound by love rather than by patron-client obligations. They meet at night to avoid attention, pray in their homes rather than in public, and hope authorities will not notice them. These various religious expressions, traditional and imported, public and private, coexist in Rome with varying degrees of tension. The city's religious landscape is as complex as its social structure, reflecting its evolution from city-state to capital of an empire that includes dozens of peoples and hundreds of local traditions. Rome's genius has always been its ability to absorb and adapt, to incorporate foreign elements while maintaining an essentially Roman character. But this adaptability has limits, and determining those limits is an ongoing process, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, always consequential for those whose beliefs place them outside accepted bounds. History remembers the dramatic moments: Caesar's assassination, Augustus's rise, Nero's fire, the succession of emperors. But for most Romans, history is not dramatic. It is the slow accumulation of ordinary days, the routine of waking and working and sleeping, occasionally punctuated by events of broader significance, but mostly consisting of small personal struggles and modest achievements. Quintus owns no property beyond a few pieces of furniture and his tools, but he considers himself fortunate. Many veterans fare worse, unable to find work, reduced to begging or criminal activity. Rome has no social safety net beyond the grain dole for citizens and the occasional largesse, distributed by emperors seeking popularity. Those who cannot work and have no family to support them face bleak prospects. The grain dole itself represents one of Rome's great logistical achievements and political necessities. Each month, citizen heads of household can collect a ration of wheat, enough to feed a family if supplemented with cheaper foods. The distribution occurs at designated points throughout the city, with officials checking registration lists to prevent fraud. The system is imperfect, corruption is endemic, but it prevents the mass starvation that would otherwise occur in a city whose population far exceeds what its local agriculture can support. The grain arrives by ship from Egypt and North Africa, tribute from Rome's breadbasket provinces. Massive granaries near the Tiber store months of supply against disruption. The entire operation, from field to distribution point, employs thousands and costs the imperial treasury enormous sums. But emperors who allow grain shortages risk riots and rebellion. Bread and circuses, as the satirist Juvenal would later write, are what the Roman masses demand, and emperors who fail to provide them do so at their peril. Quintus's life, like most Roman lives, follows the rhythm of the seasons and the festival calendar. Winter brings shorter working hours and more time indoors, huddled around small charcoal braziers that provide inadequate heat. Spring brings renewal and hope, longer days, warmer temperatures, the city awakening from its winter torpor. Summer brings oppressive heat that makes afternoon work nearly impossible and drives those who can afford it to villas in the countryside. Autumn brings harvest, falling temperatures, and preparation for winter's return. The festivals that punctuate the calendar provide breaks in routine and opportunities for community celebration. Some festivals are solemn religious observances restricted to priests and magistrates. Others are public celebrations involving games, feasts, and entertainment. Saturnalia in December allows a brief inversion of social order. Slaves are briefly freed from their duties. Masters serve them meals. Gambling is permitted. Gifts are exchanged. The festival provides a safety valve, allowing temporary release from social constraints before normal hierarchy reasserts itself. Quintus's neighborhood in the Aventine is neither wealthy nor desperately poor. Shopkeepers, craftsmen, mid-level bureaucrats, and veterans like himself populate its streets. The insulae here are better maintained than in the Subura, only 4 or 5 stories rather than 6 or 7, with broader streets that reduce fire danger somewhat. A neighborhood association, one of many collegia that organize Rome's working people, maintains a small shrine and funds burial plots for members who die. These collegia serve multiple functions. They are mutual aid societies that help members during illness or hardship. They are social clubs where people of similar trades gather to drink and socialize. They are religious organizations that maintain shrines and fund festivals. And they are potential power bases that emperors and senators watch warily, aware that organizations of workers could become vehicles for sedition if circumstances push them that direction. The Senate still meets, still debates, still passes laws, but everyone understands that real power resides elsewhere. The emperors, whatever their official title, dictator, princeps, August I, hold authority that overshadows all republican institutions. The Senate has become largely advisory, rubber-stamping imperial decisions and providing a veneer of traditional legitimacy. Individual senators may still wield influence through personal relationships with the emperor, but the Senate as an institution has been neutered. This transformation happened gradually enough that many Romans could pretend nothing fundamental had changed. The Republic's forms persisted. Elections were still held for magistracies. The Senate still convened. But substance had shifted to the imperial household, to the emperor's advisors and freedmen, to the Praetorian Guard that protected the emperor and sometimes decided who would be emperor. The assassination of Caesar did not save the Republic. It merely ensured that the Republic's death would be slower and more complicated than if he had lived to formalize what his victory had already established. For Quintus and Romans like him, these constitutional questions matter less than immediate concerns. The question is not whether Rome is a republic or a monarchy, but whether the emperor maintains peace, keeps grain supplies flowing, ensures that courts function and roads are safe. Most Romans would trade abstract liberty for concrete security, and the emperors, wise ones at least, understand this calculation. The empire's vastness creates both opportunities and problems. Roman citizenship, once restricted to residents of the city, has been extended over centuries to allies and subjects across the Mediterranean. This inclusivity binds diverse peoples to Rome and creates a shared identity that transcends local loyalties. But it also dilutes what Romang means, transforming it from an ethnic identity into a legal status that can be held by Gauls. Iberians, Greeks, Syrians, Africans, and eventually even Britons from the edge of the known world. Trade follows the legions, binding the empire economically as well as politically. Ships carry grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, slaves from everywhere. Roads built initially for military purposes facilitate commercial traffic. Cities throughout the empire adopt Roman architectural styles, build forums and baths and amphitheaters, creating a visual uniformity that announces Roman presence even in remote provinces. Latin spreads as the language of administration and commerce, though Greek remains dominant in the eastern provinces. This integration creates a cosmopolitan urban culture, at least among elites. A wealthy merchant in Alexandria, a senator in Rome, and a city councilor in Londinium might share more cultural assumptions with each other than with the rural peasants in their own regions. They read the same literature, admire the same architecture, share similar values regarding honor, status, and proper behavior. The Romang Empire creates, perhaps for the first time in history, a truly international ruling class, bound by common culture rather than merely by conquest. But beneath this imperial elite, local cultures persist. Rural villagers in Gaul continue speaking Celtic languages and worshiping traditional gods, alongside officially sanctioned Roman deities. Egyptian farmers maintain practices unchanged since pharaonic times. Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine remain largely untouched by Roman culture, despite centuries of contact. Rome's genius for assimilation has limits, and the empire contains multitudes that Roman culture touches only superficially. The insula where Marcus the baker lives is typical of Roman urban housing. Built of brick and wood with stone foundations, it rises 5 stories, each floor overhanging the one below slightly, creating a precarious appearance that sometimes proves prophetic when buildings collapse. The ground floor, which commands higher rents due to easier access and less climbing, houses shops that open onto the street. Marcus's bakery, a wine shop, a barber, a shoe repair establishment. The upper floors are divided into apartments of decreasing size and quality, with the smallest, cheapest units on the top floor, where fire danger is greatest and water hauling most laborious. No running water reaches these apartments. Residents must fetch water from public fountains or pay water carriers to deliver it. No sewage system connects to individual apartments. Chamber pots are emptied into communal cesspits or simply thrown into the streets at night, leading to laws requiring warning shouts before dumping, but achieving limited compliance. The streets, especially in poor neighborhoods, are frequently fouled with human waste, rotting garbage, and the effluvia of urban life. Wealthy Romans live differently. A domus, a private house, provides space, privacy, and comfort impossible in an insula. Built around a central courtyard called the atrium, which admits light and rainwater that collects in a pool called the impluvium. The domus separates family quarters from public spaces, where the paterfamilias receives clients and conducts business. Rooms are decorated with frescoes and mosaics. Gardens provide greenery and tranquility. Private baths, though smaller than public facilities, offer convenience and hygiene. The wealthiest maintain multiple residences: a city house near the Forum, a villa in the countryside for escaping summer heat, perhaps a seaside retreat at Baia or Antium. These villas are not merely large, but luxurious, featuring elaborate gardens, private theaters, heated pools, libraries, and art collections. They demonstrate wealth, certainly, but they also reflect a particular philosophy about how life should be lived in comfortable surroundings that allow for leisure, cultivation of the arts, and philosophical contemplation. This gulf between rich and poor is neither hidden nor particularly remarked upon. Romans accept social hierarchy as natural and divinely ordained. The poor do not generally resent the wealthy for being wealthy, but for failing to fulfill the obligations wealth brings. A rich man who uses his fortune to sponsor games, fund public buildings, support clients, and otherwise benefit the community earns respect. A rich man who hoards his wealth, who refuses to act as patron, who treats inferiors with contempt, earns condemnation regardless of his fortune's size. The patron-client relationship structures much of Roman social life. A poor man attaches himself to a wealthy patron, visiting him each morning to pay respects, voting as directed, providing whatever services the patron requires. In exchange, the patron provides protection, loans during hardships, help finding employment, and perhaps occasional gifts of food or money. It is not friendship, though affection may develop, but mutual obligation, formalized through tradition and social pressure. Marcus the baker is client to Gaius Cornelius, a moderately wealthy merchant who owns the building housing Marcus's bakery. Each morning, Marcus joins other clients visiting Cornelius's domus, waiting in the atrium until admitted to the patron's presence. The visit is brief, rarely more than a few words exchanged, but it fulfills ritual obligation and maintains the bond. In return, Cornelius keeps Marcus's rent affordable, provides loans when needed, and uses his influence to help Marcus win contracts supplying bread to larger establishments. This network of obligations extends upward. Cornelius himself is client. To a senator, visiting that greater patron's house each morning, providing political support, managing business affairs. The senator, in turn, has obligations to the emperor or to more powerful senators. The entire social structure resembles a pyramid of mutual dependency, with each level bound to the ones above and below through obligations that are simultaneously economic, political, and social. Roman meals reflect social status with painful clarity. The poor eat porridge made from grain, supplemented with whatever vegetables are cheap, occasionally fish or small birds, almost never meat. Bread forms the staple, sometimes dipped in wine or olive oil for flavor. The diet is monotonous and barely adequate nutritionally, leading to widespread malnutrition and diseases related to vitamin deficiencies. The wealthy dine extravagantly. A formal cena, dinner party, begins in late afternoon and extends for hours. Guests recline on couches around tables, served by slaves who bring course after course. Eggs and vegetables to start, then fish, then meat, perhaps venison or boar or peacock, elaborate sauces flavoring everything, wine flowing freely, entertainment provided by musicians, dancers, or poets. The meal is theater as much as sustenance, an opportunity to display wealth and taste, to conduct business, to form alliances. Some dinner parties become legendary for their excess. Hosts compete to serve the most exotic dishes, dormice fattened, on nuts, flamingo tongues, sow's udders, pastries shaped like animals that bleed sauce when cut. Guests eat until satiated, then visit the vomitorium to purge, then return to eat more. The display appalls moralists who see in such excess the corruption of traditional Roman virtues. But the practice continues because social competition demands constantly escalating demonstrations of wealth. Between these extremes, most Romans eat modestly. A meal might consist of bread, olives, cheese, perhaps some fish or sausage, fruit in season, wine mixed with water. Families eat together, father presiding, children served after adults, slaves eating separately. The meal provides not just nutrition, but family cohesion, a daily ritual that reinforces hierarchy and bonds. Food comes from across the empire. The olive oil on Marcus's table was pressed in Spain. The inn comes from Campania or perhaps Gaul. The fish, if he can afford it, might have been caught in the Adriatic or the Black Sea. The grain used in his bread was grown in Egypt or North Africa. This culinary cosmopolitanism reflects the empire's integration, the way trade networks link distant regions into economic interdependence. But it also creates vulnerability. When grain ships are delayed by storms, when provinces suffer poor harvests, when wars disrupt trade routes, Rome feels the effects immediately. The city is entirely dependent on imports, producing almost nothing of what it consumes. This dependence on supply lines stretching thousands of miles is simultaneously a logistical marvel and a strategic weakness. Emperors understand that controlling grain supplies means controlling Rome, and they guard that control jealously. Young Marcus, son of the baker, walks through dawn streets to the Ludus, the elementary school located in rented rooms above a shop. He carries a wax tablet for writing and a small cloth bag containing his breakfast, bread and an apple. The school day begins at dawn and continues until midday, leaving afternoons free for other activities or for children from working families, labor in family businesses. The teacher, a freedman named Quintus Caecilius, greets his 15 students with neither warmth nor particular hostility. Teaching is not a prestigious profession. Most teachers are Greeks or educated freedmen who lack better opportunities. The pay is modest, supplied partly by small tuition fees from students' families and partly by donations from wealthy patrons, who consider funding education as civic duty. Quintus Caecilius teaches because he has few alternatives, having been freed by his master with no particular skills beyond literacy and numeracy. The morning begins with recitation. Students memorize and repeat passages from Homer's Iliad. Rendered into Latin, the text's martial themes are considered appropriate for boys who must learn to be men, to value courage and honor, to understand that glory comes through virtuous action. The pedagogical method relies on memorization and repetition. Understanding will supposedly emerge naturally through familiarity with great texts. Next comes writing practice. Students scratch letters onto their wax tablets with iron styluses, forming first individual characters, then simple words, then brief sentences. The teacher moves among them, correcting errors with sharp raps to knuckles or heads. Roman education is not gentle. Physical punishment for mistakes is expected and accepted. Boys who will grow to be men must learn discipline, and discipline comes through pain. Basic arithmetic follows: addition, subtraction, multiplication, using methods unwieldy but functional. Roman numerals lack the elegant efficiency of the Arabic numerals that will eventually replace them, making calculation laborious. Most students will never advance beyond basic computation. But even this represents education beyond what the majority of Romans receive. Girls attend elementary schools less frequently than boys. Marcus's sister stayed home after 2 years of schooling, enough to achieve basic literacy, but not enough for serious education. She now helps in her mother's domestic work, learning skills considered more appropriate for females: spinning, weaving, managing household slaves, preparing food. The assumption, shared broadly across Roman society, is that women's sphere is domestic, that their education should prepare them for managing households, not for participating in public life. For boys from wealthy families, education continues beyond the ludus. A grammaticus, a secondary teacher, instructs them in Greek as well as Latin, in literature, history, and rhetoric. These students read Cicero and Virgil, study Greek tragedy, learn to compose their own speeches and poetry. The goal is to produce cultured men capable of participating in public life, of speaking persuasively in law courts and assemblies, of appreciating art and literature. The wealthiest families hire private tutors, usually educated Greek slaves, who provide personalized instruction. These pedagogues become part of the household, sometimes developing close bonds with their students, sometimes bitterly resenting their servitude. A pedagogue might be more educated than his master, might have been a philosopher or poet before capture and enslavement, but he serves at his master's pleasure and can be punished or sold at any time. The highest level of education focuses on rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. Adolescent boys study under rhetoricians who teach them to argue any side of any question, to ornament speeches with classical allusions and elegant phrases, to sway audiences through voice, gesture, and emotional appeal. This education is intensely practical, preparing students for law courts and political careers, but it is also cultural, marking those who possess it as members of the educated elite. Young Marcus will not progress beyond elementary school. His father cannot afford further tuition, and Marcus's labor is needed in the bakery. He will learn to read simple texts, to calculate profits and losses, to write basic contracts and receipts. This limited literacy places him above the majority of Romans, but far below the educated elite. His education will be practical, taught through apprenticeship, focused on the specific skills his trade requires. Does Marcus resent this limitation? Perhaps, though he likely accepts it as natural. Roman society offers limited social mobility. A baker's son usually becomes a baker. A carpenter's son learns carpentry. Wealth and status are inherited more often than earned. Exceptions exist: freedmen who prosper in business, soldiers who rise through merit, but these are remarkable precisely because they are uncommon. Yet Rome's ideology emphasizes virtue over birth. The heroes of Roman history are often men of modest origins, who rose through ability and character. Cincinnatus, called from his plow to save the Republic, then returning to his farm after victory. Marius, the common soldier who became consul 7 times. These stories suggest that merit can overcome humble birth, providing hope even to those whose circumstances offer little realistic prospect of advancement. This tension between ideology and reality characterizes much of Roman life. Rome celebrates ancestral virtue while creating systems that perpetuate privilege. It praises simple living while wallowing in luxury. It claims to value liberty while maintaining an empire built on conquest and slavery. These contradictions are not particularly remarked upon by Romans themselves, who see them as normal features of a complex society rather than as problems requiring resolution. Education itself reflects this ambiguity. It is praised as the path to virtue and civic participation, yet it is also a marker of social status that reinforces existing hierarchies. Those who receive extensive education join an elite defined partly by shared cultural knowledge, while those lacking education are excluded from full participation in political and cultural life. The rhetorician who preaches that virtue matters more than birth has usually been born into circumstances that provided access to his rhetorical training. A child's cry pierces the night in the insula. Marcus's wife, Lucia, has gone into labor with their third child, 2 years after their second daughter's birth. The midwife, an elderly woman from the neighborhood who has delivered hundreds of babies, arrives with her bag of instruments and herbs. She shoos Marcus from the room. Childbirth is women's work. Men serve only to pace and worry. The labor progresses through the night. In the absence of effective pain relief, Lucia endures what women have endured since humanity began, alternating between screaming and grim silence, clutching an amulet to the goddess Juno, who protects women in childbirth. The midwife offers encouragement and herbal draughts that may help or may be merely placebo. Medicine in Rome is part empirical knowledge, accumulated through practice, and part superstition impossible to disentangle from genuine therapeutic technique. Dawn arrives with a final, terrible effort, and the child emerges, a boy, healthy, crying lustily. The midwife cuts the umbilical cord, washes the infant, checks for obvious deformities. Finding none, she announces success. Lucia, exhausted and bleeding, nevertheless smiles. A son, a potential heir, someone to carry the family name and perhaps care for them in old age. But the danger is not past. Childbed fever kills many women in the days following delivery. Roman medicine does not understand infection, does not grasp that the midwife's unwashed hands carry disease from patient to patient. Lucia will spend the next week in bed, watch carefully for signs of fever or excessive bleeding. If she survives these critical days, her chances of full recovery become good. But many women do not survive. Of Marcus and Lucia's 3 children, 2 have died. The first, a daughter, succumbed to fever at age 2. The second, a son, lived only days, too weak to thrive. Their surviving daughter, now 7, is robust and healthy, but there is no guarantee she will reach adulthood. Childhood diseases, smallpox, measles, dysentery, claim lives constantly. Roman families expect to lose children. The Stoic philosophy that many Romans adopt is partly a coping mechanism for this perpetual grief. Life expectancy in Rome is brutally short by modern standards. Those who survive childhood might reach 40 or 50, but many die younger from disease, accident, or violence. The wealthy, with better nutrition and less exposure to occupational hazards, live somewhat longer, but even they are vulnerable to diseases that do not discriminate by class. Roman medicine is a strange blend of observation and theory, of practical techniques and elaborate explanations. Greek medical texts, particularly those attributed to Hippocrates and Galen, dominate theoretical understanding. These works identify 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance supposedly determines health. Illness results from humoral imbalance, to be corrected through diet, bloodletting, or administration of substances with opposite properties. This theoretical framework is wrong, but it provides a systematic approach to treatment and allows physicians to claim expertise based on learned knowledge, rather than merely trial and error. Some treatments based on humoral theory are harmless or even beneficial. Others, particularly aggressive bloodletting, probably kill more patients than they cure. But in the absence of better understanding, physicians do what their training teaches, and patients, having no alternatives, accept their ministrations. Surgical techniques are more advanced than medical theory. Roman military surgeons developed considerable skill at treating wounds, removing arrows, and amputating damaged limbs. Their instruments, scalpels, forceps, bone saws, look remarkably similar to modern surgical tools. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, surgery is agonizing and frequently fatal due to infection. But skilled surgeons achieve success rates that suggest genuine therapeutic effect beyond placebo. Herbal remedies constitute a significant portion of Roman medicine. Some have genuine pharmaceutical properties. Willow bark, containing salicin, a precursor to aspirin, relieves pain and reduces fever. Opium poppy derivatives provide powerful pain relief, though addiction becomes a recognized problem. Many other remedies have no demonstrable effect beyond placebo, but even placebo provides real benefit when patients believe in treatment's efficacy. Public health infrastructure represents Rome's most significant medical achievement. Aqueducts bring clean water. Sewers remove waste, though not from most private residences. Public baths promote hygiene. These measures, though not undertaken with modern understanding of disease transmission, nonetheless improve health outcomes significantly compared to cities lacking such infrastructure. But Rome also has features that promote disease. Dense population facilitates contagion transmission. The practice of exposing unwanted infants creates populations of abandoned children vulnerable to exploitation and disease. Slavery concentrates people in cramped quarters with poor nutrition and harsh working conditions. The baths, while promoting cleanliness, also spread waterborne diseases. Lead pipes used in plumbing leach poison into water supplies, causing chronic health problems, though Romans do not recognize the connection. The physician who attends wealthy families enjoys respect and sometimes friendship from patients. Medicine is not yet a profession regulated by examinations and licensing. Anyone can claim to be a physician. But those with successful practices build reputations based on results, or at least on patient satisfaction. They prescribe elaborate regimens of diet and exercise, take pulses, examine urine, and offer prognosis that range from realistic to wildly optimistic. For the poor, medical care is rudimentary. They rely on folk remedies, on temple medicine where priests of Asclepius interpret dreams for diagnostic purposes, on quacks selling patent medicines of dubious value. When seriously ill, they often simply die, their bodies carried to paupers' graves outside the city walls. Rome maintains no hospitals in the modern sense, no charitable institutions devoted to caring for the sick poor. Such care as exists comes from family, from neighbors, from voluntary associations that pool resources to help members. This casual acceptance of death pervades Roman culture. Funerals are public events, especially for the wealthy, with professional mourners hired to wail and lament, with processions featuring masks of ancestors, with eulogies praising the deceased's virtues. The body is cremated, or, less commonly, buried, with grave goods provided for the afterlife, though beliefs about post-mortem existence remain vague and contradictory. Epitaphs on tombstones range from formal and dignified to surprisingly intimate. To the spirits of the departed is the standard opening, followed by the deceased's name and perhaps accomplishments. But many inscriptions reveal genuine emotion. A husband mourning a wife who died young, a parent grieving a child lost too soon, friends memorializing companions who will be missed. Death is omnipresent, yet Romans find ways to honor the dead while continuing with the business of living. Centuries pass. Emperors succeed each other through inheritance, assassination, civil war, and occasionally natural death. The empire expands to its greatest extent under Trajan, then gradually contracts under pressure from Germanic tribes, Persians, economic crisis, and internal decay. Rome itself remains magnificent, but begins showing signs of strain. The population declines as economic opportunities migrate to provincial cities. The insulae, built hastily and maintained poorly, collapse more frequently. Fires devastate entire districts with depressing regularity. The imperial government, increasingly desperate for revenue to pay the army and administer the vast empire, raises taxes to levels that crush productive enterprise. Inflation erodes the currency's value as emperors debase coinage to stretch limited silver supplies. The army, once Rome's pride, becomes increasingly barbarian in composition. Germanic tribesmen are recruited to fight other Germanic tribesmen. Whole units maintain their tribal languages and customs, viewing service to Rome as temporary employment rather than as sacred duty. Generals with armies behind them bid for imperial power, leading to civil wars that drain resources and destabilize borders. Christianity, once a persecuted sect meeting in secret, gains converts and eventually imperial favor. Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century CE transforms the religion from marginal to mainstream. Christian bishops gain wealth and influence. Temples to traditional gods fall into disuse or are converted to churches. The religious landscape that had been pluralistic becomes increasingly Christian, though pagan practices persist, especially in rural areas, where pagan itself derives from paganus, meaning rural dweller. Rome's centrality erodes. Constantine establishes a new capital, Constantinople, better positioned to defend the empire's eastern provinces, where wealth and population are concentrated. Western emperors sometimes rule from Milan or Ravenna rather than Rome itself. The city that had been the world's center becomes a backwater, maintaining symbolic importance but losing practical power. The sack of Rome by Visigoths in 410 CE shocks the world. Rome had not fallen to foreign enemies in 8 centuries. That it could fall now suggests the empire's fundamental weakness. The sack itself is limited. The Visigoths pillage, but do not stay or destroy the city. But the psychological impact is enormous. Rome was supposed to be eternal. If Rome can fall, nothing is permanent. The Western Empire limps along for another 60 years before the final collapse. In 476 CE, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposes the last Western emperor, the ironically named Romulus Augustulus. The event passes with little contemporary notice. The Eastern Empire continues in Constantinople, will continue for another millennium, calling itself Rome, though Greeks dominate it. But the Western Empire, the Rome of Caesar and Augustus, of Cicero and Virgil, of marble temples and triumphal arches, has ended. Yet Rome persists. The physical city survives, diminished but present. The Pope, Bishop of Rome, emerges as a significant power, claiming spiritual authority that in some ways surpasses the vanished emperor's temporal power. Pilgrims come to visit the tombs of Peter and Paul. The ruins become quarries for later builders, ancient marble repurposed for medieval churches. Goats graze in the forum where senators once debated. What remains of Rome after the fall? Physically, ruins that later ages will find romantic and inspiring. Culturally, Latin language evolving into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, spreading Roman linguistic influence even as political power vanishes. Legally, Roman law concepts preserved through Byzantine codification and later medieval study, influencing legal systems across Europe, and eventually the world. Intellectually, Latin and Greek texts preserved by monks and Islamic scholars, transmitted to Renaissance Europe where they spark cultural revolution. Marcus the baker's descendants, if any survive, are indistinguishable from other Italians. The family memory, the specific stories of his struggles and modest achievements, have vanished. But something of Roman life persists in customs, in social patterns, in the physical layout of cities throughout former Roman territories. Rome fell, but Roman influence proved harder to eradicate than Roman power. The question of why Rome fell has occupied historians for centuries. Theories proliferate: lead poisoning from pipes, moral decay, Christianity undermining martial virtues, economic exhaustion, climate change, slavery undermining free labor, barbarian invasion, overstretched borders, political instability, currency debasement. Probably all these factors contributed. No single cause explains so complex an event as an empire's collapse. Civilizations, like organisms, age and die for multiple overlapping reasons. Perhaps more interesting than why Rome fell is why it lasted so long. For over 5 centuries, Rome maintained an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. It integrated diverse peoples into a functioning system, spread a common culture without completely erasing local identities, maintained infrastructure and trade networks on an unprecedented scale. That it eventually fell is unsurprising. That it succeeded for so long remains remarkable. The Rome of daily life, of bakers and shopkeepers, of schoolboys and midwives, of bathhouse conversations and forum gossip, this Rome is less remembered than the Rome of emperors and generals. But it was this Rome that constituted the empire's substance. Laws and armies provide structure, but people, ordinary people pursuing ordinary lives, provide content. Their struggles to survive, to prosper, to find meaning in existence, these are the human story that transcends specific civilizations. Marcus the baker rising before dawn to knead dough, worrying about rent and customers, loving his wife and children, accepting his modest station while hoping his children might rise slightly higher, this Marcus is more representative of Rome than Caesar or Augustus. He leaves no monuments, writes no books, conquers no territories. But he and millions like him keep the city functioning, provide the economic and social foundation on which emperors build their glory. His life is hard, his prospects limited, his death unmourned beyond his immediate circle. Yet there is dignity in his labor, meaning in his relationships, satisfaction in small achievements. He takes pride in his bread's quality, in providing for his family, in fulfilling obligations to his patron and his gods. By his own standards, modest as they are, he has lived well enough. The Tiber flows as it has always flowed, indifferent to empires and republics, to rises and falls. The 7 hills remain, though what stands upon them changes. Sheep graze where the Senate once met. Vines grow on abandoned temples. But beneath the decay, the foundations remain, waiting for future ages to rediscover and reimagine them. Rome fell, but the memory of Rome, the idea of Rome, proved eternal in ways the physical empire never could be. Each age reinvents Rome according to its needs. Renaissance humanists finding in classical texts models for cultural renewal. Enlightenment philosophers seeing in the Republic inspiration for revolutionary government. Victorians projecting their own imperial ambitions onto Roman precedent. These reinventions say more about their creators than about historical Rome, but they demonstrate Rome's persistent hold on Western imagination. The Rome of daily life, unglamorous and often harsh, offers different lessons. It shows human beings coping with challenges that transcend specific historical moments: economic insecurity, social hierarchy, family obligations, the search for meaning in apparently meaningless existence. The specific forms differ. The insulae and togas have vanished, but the underlying human concerns remain recognizable. We still wake before dawn to work. We still worry about feeding our families. We still seek dignity in our labor and hope our children might have better lives than we do. In this continuity lies Rome's truest legacy. Not in laws or languages or ruined aqueducts, though these matter, but in the demonstration that human beings can build civilizations, can create order from chaos, can maintain systems that, however imperfect, allow millions to live together with some measure of peace and prosperity. Rome fell. All civilizations fall eventually, but the human capacity to build and sustain complex societies survives, manifesting in new forms, facing new challenges, but fundamentally unchanged. The story of Rome is ultimately the human story, told in a specific time and place, but resonating across the ages. It is a story of ambition and limitation, of achievement and failure, of glory and squalor existing side by side. It is a story worth remembering, not because Romans were superior to other peoples, they were, not but because their story illuminates possibilities and problems that remain relevant as long as humans live in cities and organize themselves into complex societies. As twilight settles over the ruins, as shadows lengthen across empty forums and crumbling temples, the ghosts of ancient Rome perhaps still walk. Marcus the baker, rising one more time before dawn, kneading one more batch of dough, serving one more customer, living one more ordinary day in the extraordinary city that called itself eternal. His ghost, like Rome itself, persists not in monuments, but in memory, in the continuing human story of which he was one small but essential part. Flavius, now in his 50s, has lived through the reigns of 3 emperors. As a young man, he served in the legions, marching to the northern frontiers, where he fought Germanic tribes who periodically tested Rome's boundaries. He was wounded twice, nothing serious enough to discharge him, but enough to leave scars and chronic pain. After his 25 years of service, he received his discharge bonus and veterans' allotment of land. But the land, located in a recently conquered province, proved difficult to farm. The locals were hostile, the soil poor, the isolation depressing. After 3 years, Quintus sold his allotment for a fraction of its nominal value and returned to Rome, where at least he knew people and could find work. He now serves as foreman for a construction contractor, overseeing crews of slaves and hired laborers who maintain Rome's constant building projects. The work is hard and the pay modest, but Quintus has achieved a life he considers respectable. He married a freedwoman who brought a small dowry. They have 2 surviving children. 3 others died in infancy, a common tragedy that Romans accept with stoic resignation. His son is learning a trade, carpentry, that should provide steady employment. His daughter will be married soon to the son of another veteran, a match based on practical considerations rather than romantic love. Quintus,